Welcome back to the Poor Pro's Almanac. Today, we dive into the fascinating world of plant genomics and crop improvement with a distinguished researcher at the intersection of bioinformatics and agriculture. We're excited to talk with Dr. Stephen Cannon, a collaborator associate professor in the agronomy department and research geneticist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. Steve's worked heavily in bioinformatics for crop domestication improvement with a focus on soybean and other unique crop legumes, including peanuts, as well as groundnuts. One of the unique areas that Dr. Cannon has worked is with continuing the work of Dr. Bill Blackman, who you may know from the LSU research project. When he left the program, the research continued on at Iowa State University, where Dr. Cannon picked up the torch. We chat about the groundnut and its future, as well as why research stopped on the groundnut and where it should be going today. So tune in and let us know what you think. Dr. Cannon, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up, specializing in legumes?
Well, I guess my first exposure to them would have been like many of us, eating them as a kid. And then I was also a gardener as a child, working with my grandfather. And then in high school and college, I maintained a garden and helped feed our family that way. Then much later, I went back to school in my mid-30s, got a PhD in plant biology. Ended up working on the sequencing project for the first legume to be sequenced. That's one that we don't eat. It's a relative of alfalfa, but it's used as a model species. And since then, I was hired by the USDA to manage genetic data for plant breeding, focusing on this group of species, legumes.
Yeah, your name keeps coming up as I do research in various things, and I was like, I gotta reach out. And one area in particular is with Apios americana, or groundnut. It's kind of got a cult following, and it's got a really curious history because of the breeding work done at LSU. So now there's the LSU variety that you can buy. People are working independently to improve on LSU, and being a starchy root crop that also has the traits of a bean of nitrogen fixation and so on, it offers a lot of really appealing traits to a backyard grower, or even from like a bigger, like major crop standpoint. On the surface, it looks like it's very appealing. It has all these really great qualities that we would want. I know you kind of, I don't know if the word inherited is the right word, but you managed to get involved with the continuation of some of that research in Iowa. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So LSU, Louisiana State University, the people working on Apios first there were Bill Blackman and his research technician, Bertil Reynolds. In the 1980s, they went around the country, mostly focusing on the South, Louisiana and surrounding states, collecting Apios from the wild. It tends to grow naturally near bodies of water, lakes, rivers. So they collected a lot of varieties and crossed those and evaluated those crosses for several years. Bill Blackman retired in the early 90s. He carried some of those improved lines or selected lines with him to Virginia, and some of them remained with Louisiana State. As you said, I did inherit some of that collection. I have a good friend, Gautam Bhattacharya, who contacted Bill Blackman, and then Bill sent me that collection. Then in 2014, 2015, I had a student, Vikas Balamkar, who evaluated those lines in a number of different ways. A number of publications resulted from his work.
Yeah, I saw that there was a bit of identified selections. In reading the papers that came out on it, there were a couple lines that were as productive as yams, or at least in terms of weight, which was really impressive. And I think like speaks to the capacity of the plant to maybe be bred more selectively for improvement. So I know you've worked with it quite a bit at this point. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on whether or not it has some potential or if maybe there's some shortfalls that may not be as obvious to somebody that just sees that academic data as to why it's not really being continued today.
Sure. Well, let me give a little background about it. Like virtually all crops that we use, it started as an important crop for indigenous people. Most of the beans that we use, for example, were domesticated in Central America and South America. Apios is unusual in that it was used as a crop in North America. There aren't a lot of indigenous North American crops, but Apios is one of those. As far as we know, it was mostly wild harvested. There might have been some selection as native groups carried lines from place to place. One bit of evidence for that is that there is a population in the Northeast that is probably sterile, but it goes all the way up into the east coast of Canada. So it was very likely carried by tribes in that area. So it was used by tribes throughout the eastern half of North America, dug probably in the fall or spring along stream banks. The qualities that they would have valued are the same ones that are valuable now. It's quite productive. It keeps well. So if you're looking for some food in the springtime, when not much else is growing, if you know where to find it, there it is. It's fairly high protein, about 3 to 4 times as much protein as a solanum potato. It has a good edible starch content, and it's well adapted here. So seems to be pretty disease resistant, relatively drought tolerant, tolerant of flooding. So for all of those reasons, it seems like a great crop, and I think it is. But there's also reasons that it hasn't taken off as a crop. One is that it has to be dug. So a little bit like, solanum potato, you have to do some work to harvest it. But unlike Irish potato, I keep calling it solanum potato because it's not Irish, it's South American, but you have to do more digging for Apios because the tubers form on underground stolons, and those tubers might be separated by ranging from inches to a foot or more from tuber to tuber. So you end up having to do quite a bit of digging. That's probably the main reason that it hasn't been domesticated, is just kind of the difficulty in management. Also, it's perennial, so we don't have good systems for mechanical harvest of underground perennial crops.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. God, I can't even imagine a foot-long stolon. Because I'll harvest them here. I live in New England, and I'll harvest them around a couple ponds nearby. And I mean, when you're out there and it's like October, this time of year, October, November, and you're digging out in the dirt and you start getting wet, like, I can't imagine having to dig down like a foot to find like a little groundnut.
Well, I should clarify, it's not that they are deep, it's that the stolons themselves are long. They go kind of not far below the surface, but they can go many, many feet. So to follow that stolon takes some effort.
Yeah, it's a little bit like fishing, a little, trying to pull the thread, trying to figure out where it's going without snapping it, which I could see how that could be a challenge for breeding. I know that was one of the things that did come up in the paper is identifying specific lines that had shorter stolon lengths. And I'm not sure if you found any correlation. This is probably getting a little bit into the weeds a little bit, but if you did find any correlation between the stolon length and the size of the actual tuber?
Well, we think that there's a correlation between the length of the above ground vines and the below ground stolons.
Interesting.
And that would make a lot of sense botanically because a stolon is simply an underground vine.
Yeah. So the project is, as far as I know, over. So like what's going on with those genetics? Are they just sitting in some storage facility, or Is somebody playing with them at all? Like, is there anything cool going on that might be coming out with these guys?
Well, I would say there are undoubtedly a lot of cool things going on that I don't know about. Just in the sense that, as you pointed out, it's kind of got a cult following, and a lot of people are growing it, or so I'm sure that a lot of people are growing it and holding on to the lines that they like best. So in that sense, I think it's probably following the trajectory of many crops historically. As land races are selected, people pick their favorite lines and keep growing them.
Mm.
We're not doing much directly here in my group, apart from genome sequencing, which is not trivial. But once we have that genome sequence, then it'll make some other molecular studies easier.
Mm. I listened to an interview that you did a while back, and you were talking about cooking with groundnuts. And you made a comment that I started thinking, it's kind of like sat in my head a little bit. You're talking about how you can make a soup and it can kind of taste like, I believe you described it as like boiled peanuts, because I guess you were saying that genetically the split between peanuts and groundnuts was like 50,000 years ago or something like that.
Well,
And my numbers might be way off.
50 million. Well,
50 million, yeah. So yeah, my numbers are a little off. My son has a peanut allergy, so I always care whenever someone talks about like being related to. Do you have any concerns about it as a crop for allergic reasons, or because of its proximity to peanut?
So it's actually not any closer to peanut than any bean is to peanut.
Okay.
So the 50 million year, give or take a few million, that probably is accurate. Apios is in the group of what's sometimes called warm season legumes, with lima bean and soybean and common bean and so on. So it's in the bean group. Peanut kind of sits on its own, quite distantly related to those in the same subfamily in the legumes, but it's an early diverging branch.
Gotcha. Okay.
But to your question about allergy, I would say that's something that's not been rigorously evaluated.
Yeah.
There have been informal reports of some people getting some kind of stomach distress or upset. It seemed, as far as I can tell, it's inconsistent. Like people will eat it happily, and then they'll eat it later and have a stomach ache. Whether that's associated with the peanut or the preparation, or I mean, not the peanut, the groundnut, I don't know.
Gotcha.
But sorry if there is some kind of allergenic compound, I would say it's very unlikely to be the same kind of compound as peanut, because the allergen in peanut is a seed storage protein. If there's an allergen in groundnut, it's probably something else.
That makes sense. I want to jump into some of your other research as well. You're one of the managing editors of Legume Perspectives, which is a journal that focuses on legumes, obviously. I stumbled across it because I was doing research about various plants, and there's so many really cool niche crops that are talked about in the magazine, which I really appreciate. Prairie turnip and tuberous pea being two that I have a lot of interest in. And there's, as you probably know, not a whole lot of stuff being written about these types of plants. So when you can find some place where it's all in one spot, it's kind of a nice little treat to find. As the editor, somebody who's spent a lot of time with various legumes, I'm curious about what you think are some more, I guess, underutilized. Like, we're talking about how like groundnuts have this cult following. What are some of the ones that maybe that you're like, man, all this plant needs is the right, like a little bit of funding, and it's going to be like, it's going to make this huge step forward. Like it's almost there kind of thing.
Well, it's a great question, because I do think about that sort of thing a lot. I should clarify that I'm not editor of that. It's an unusual publication. It's not a standard academic publication with regular peer review. It's kind of a labor of love, kind of a zine.
Yeah. That was the impression I got. I got the impression it was like a voluntary, this edition you were the editor for kind of thing.
That's right. That's a good clarification. So there's a sort of roving editors that are
Mm.
specialists in their particular topic. So yeah, this issue from a few years ago was about tuberous legumes, and yeah, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of legume crops. I would say if you kind of list them all, most people would not be aware of most of them.
Yeah.
But even of those that most people do have some familiarity with, there are a lot. Peanut, lentil, chickpea, common bean, cowpea, pigeon pea. And then you start getting into some less common ones, winged bean, scarlet runner bean, and then some really unusual ones. And some of those are ones that we highlighted in that publication. Let's see, Tylosema or marama groundnut, some unusual African legumes. So I think all of these have promise. In many cases, I think they will be niche crops as they have traditionally. Tuber cowpea is another one. It's in the same genus as cowpea, but it's been used traditionally both in Africa and in East Asia for both the seed and the pod and the tuber. What I mentioned in passing is winged bean. That is important in East Asia, and it was domesticated in Papua New Guinea. That's one that I'm quite passionate about. That one happens to have a tuber, but you harvest it first for the young pods or the leaves. Then at the end of the season, you harvest the tuber.
Oh, wow. And it's an annual, so you can take it all in one year?
Yeah.
How big are the tubers?
Well, I know this is unfair on a podcast, but here's a picture of dinner. It's
Okay.
kind of the size of your thumb, but
Yeah.
the tubers are branched, so it's kind of like, it's not like a thumb; it's like a hand.
Mm-hmm.
So you can harvest, a cluster of these thickened roots.
Interesting. That actually kind of does remind me a little bit of tuberous pea, the way it grows, and it's an annual. How did you stumble across this crop? Is it something that you just found and dug into further, or was it something you'd been exposed to from another researcher, or?
Well, I guess since this group of plants is of interest to me generally, I hear about it here and there, and you can actually get seed for winged bean in U.S. catalogs. I probably got it from a seed company called Pine Tree Seeds. I think the catalog might have changed name over the years, but you can find winged bean. It's a good crop.
Cool. Are you doing any breeding work with it, or just growing it and consuming it and appreciating it?
Just appreciating it.
Awesome.
So to try to answer your question a little bit more directly, you asked if there are species or potential crops that have, I think, a lot of potential. I think winged bean is one. There are a lot of others that are very important globally that I think are underutilized in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not uncommon, but I love growing and eating and cooking with cowpea. It's a faster cooking bean than common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris. It's a little more tolerant of heat and drought. Another one that I like that's very common, but I think has a niche in a warming world with more climate challenge, is lima bean. It's a little more tolerant of heat and drought.
Yeah.
It was domesticated in, kind of Mexico, the desert Southwest, Central America. One thing I like about both cowpea and lima bean is that they are quite easy to grow and they're very productive in a small space in a home garden.
Yeah. Growing up, my parents are from Italy, and one of the things we had growing up were lupini beans, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. I'm actually not even sure what their Latin name is, because whenever I look up lupini beans, I always see it as a food, and then they never list it. Like, I wanted to buy some to grow. I ended up buying some dehydrated ones that I grew, but they were food grade. They're kind of like a fava bean almost, with a really thick shell that you basically brine, pickle, and then you have to like peel off the waxy coat on it.
Mhm.
But yeah, to your point, there's all these various peas and beans that we really don't utilize, even though they're available. We just, you could say it's the American diet or whatever, but we're not really utilizing them in a way that makes sense, especially I think as like this growing movement for no-till and cover crops and all these other tools to reduce the damages of agriculture, industrial agriculture. That also means we need to like figure out how to kind of shift our diet a little bit to utilize the things that we're growing that are more climate resilient, which is I think its own kind of challenge.
Yeah, so lupini beans, and I'll mention one other that's unusual in the U.S. that's important locally in Europe, including Italy. So that's Caesar or grass pea. So I'll talk briefly about those two. The first one you mentioned, lupin. There are several different lupin species that have been domesticated. At least one in South America, forget the local name, indigenous name, and then a couple in Europe. So there are Old World and New World lupins. They are very high protein. They do well in some soils that other crops have difficulty in. For example, in Western Australia, that tends to have lower fertility, droughtier, sandier soils, lupin has been developed as a relatively new crop. So it does well in that agroecological niche, and it's just a great food. It's higher protein than soybean, for example. So I think lupin is one that has a lot of potential. It also has an unusual ability. It can scavenge phosphorus from the soil, in addition to fixing its own nitrogen.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
The other one I mentioned that I've seen in Italy and other places in Europe, Caesarcia is a common name. Lathyrus sativus is the Latin name, or grass pea, it's sometimes called. That one, if you harvest it fresh, the seed reminds me of a fresh chickpea, a really good, slightly sweet, slightly crunchy, pea-like legume. That one is mostly used as a dry pulse crop in a soup, for example. Really tasty, nutritious. That one hasn't taken off because it has an anti-nutritional compound that can be dangerous if you use it as a famine food. That is, if that's all you eat, it can cause a disease or a condition called lathyrism. That said, that condition is very rare because we don't typically eat foods in exclusion, as a single dietary component.
Mm,
But I think grass pea is another one that has a future.
awesome. It's interesting. I hadn't heard of grass pea, but sounds promising. Now, one thing you'd mentioned in that journal, I think it's like kind of one of the main pieces of legume perspectives, that edition, is this idea about why some legumes grow these massive tubers, like the ones we've talked about, and then others are just like, your typical like vine, right? They just have a conventional root system. I think you suggest that, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that a lot of this is driven by like inconsistent rainfall and extreme weather as driving the plant to basically create this reserve system, almost like an emergency release valve for those dry spells and things like that. Could you speak a little bit more about whether or not that's the case and maybe if the evidence has since changed to you?
Yeah, well, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. It's our hypothesis. I'm not aware of rigorous tests of that, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggests that tubers have evolved multiple times in different lineages in the legumes. For example, there's an early diverging legume species that's important indigenous groups in South Africa called marama bean. And that will produce a gigantic underground tuber that stores water, when an infrequent rain comes in the Namibian desert. And then, later it uses that stored energy and water to produce the above ground vine and seed. that's harvested. So entirely independently in South America, you can look at other tuberous legumes. Ahipa, grown in the Andes, or the related jicama that we, purchase from the grocery store here. Both of those are tuberous legumes. And I think that those have that characteristic, that ecological characteristic you mentioned, dry, mountainous environment, pretty harsh. The plant has to go dormant sometimes,
Yeah.
One other from kind of Central America would be scarlet runner bean. That's fairly closely related to common bean. It's in the same genus, but scarlet runner bean also produces an edible thickened root. And like most of the beans from Central America, it grows in an area that's periodically dry. And those beans not only have to sort of wait out dry periods, they also have these vines. So when the conditions are right, they want to be able to climb nearby vegetation. So they have to get that stored energy from somewhere.
That makes sense. I mean, to me, that whole theory does make a lot of sense when you think about those crops. The only one, I guess, really is groundnut that wouldn't fit that kind of convention, oddly enough.
Well, it might in a slightly different way. I mean, it's probably not typically limited in terms of water, but its growth strategy is a vine and it wants to climb nearby vegetation in the spring.
Yeah, well, that's true. It does shoot up pretty quick. Yeah, that's interesting.
Now, I'll mention one more just to kind of fill out that pattern.
Go ahead.
And this one has a very sort of a deservedly bad reputation in the US, but that's kudzu, problem in the South.
Yeah.
But in East Asia, in Japan, for example, kudzu is used as a crop because the starch is edible and valuable. So if you can harvest the tubers, you can use those as well. But that's a problem in the US because, a new environment, it's kind of taken over and it rapidly climbs whatever it can climb.
Yeah, it's done a little bit of damage. We could probably do some damage back if we'd eat it, but we haven't figured that one out yet. So I guess last thing I want to bring up, and you've kind of hinted at this already, is the role that climate change is playing in how we think about crops and how we think about what our future food system looks like. That it might not be in our lifetime, but in the next couple generations, our food system is going to have to look probably fairly significantly different. And I think that some of these plants that we haven't spent as much time learning as a species may have a role in that. And I'm curious if there's any in particular that you think are uniquely capable of dealing with some of those extremes that climate change is probably going to force us to learn to grow food under.
Yeah, so let me give 3 answers to that.
Mm-hmm.
One would be something we touched on, the lupins that have been sort of newly domesticated, or at least species have been domesticated for growing in new environments, that is in Australia. So I think there's room for pretty dramatic crop improvement for things that might be crops now, but can move into new niches. Lupin would be one. I mentioned winged bean. Winged bean is a nice crop right now, but it's limited in a little bit in that the growing season is quite long, and the pods become fibrous as they get older. You might say, well, don't most legume pods, get fibrous as they get older? Well, yes, probably, but that can be selected or bred out. If you think of edible pod or snow pod peas, that's not the wild type character. That's a character that actually Mendel described as one of the traits that he was studying its genetics of, a parchmentless pea. Imagine various parchmentless beans. Okay, so that's the domestication of kind of existing crops. Another part of the answer could be finding uses for resilient species that we've not thought of as crops to this date. One I'll mention there, Pungamia. I actually don't know the common name, but it's a species that's native to India, a tree species. So being a tree, it's sort of inherently perennial. The part that's harvested is the pod and the seed, and that's being investigated actually by a company that focuses solely on domesticating and using Pungamia as an oil seed. And that's being grown in India, Australia, Florida, semi-tropical areas.
Yeah, it looks like it's called Pongame oil tree is the common name.
Okay. So the challenge there, I guess there's a breeding challenge and also a preparation or utilization challenge. The seed has some toxins, but if those can be removed either through genetics or through processing, then it's a potentially an important food.
Yeah, that's something we'd emailed back and forth about Kentucky coffee tree as like being a potential for similar reasons.
Totally, yeah. Hardy, productive tree in North America, yeah.
Yeah.
The third part of the answer I would give would be existing crops that I think we could just use differently and better. I'll mention the two that I described before, lima bean and let's see, I'll use scarlet runner bean. Those, well, again, unfair on a podcast, but this is a picture of this is some lima beans that I have harvested from our backyard. It's a population, so there's a lot of diversity in that batch of seed, and I just plant the diversity again the next year. So there's diversity inherent in it, and I harvest it. My wife and I harvest it from early summer through late fall. That's a characteristic of a lot of kind of landrace crops, that they're indeterminate. And so I think people could grow them in backyards or available farmland on a small scale, and that would provide a lot of resilience and health in their own diets.
Yeah, that's comforting that there's so many options, I think, to different ways that we can try to address some of these challenges, because it's a big one. And like I said, it may not be in our lifetime, but at some point, the continuation of the way climate change is moving, our food system and so on, something will have to change. And making sure that there are the resources to begin that process of change is always important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, climate change totally is in our lifetime. And I think that the hopeful aspect on the plant side is that I think the solutions are all also at hand, So growing things yourself, learning how to grow them, growing a lot of different things to become more experienced in what works and what doesn't for you, that's something that all of your listeners can do next year.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're listening and you want to grow any of these things, like check them out there. A diversity of delicious different legumes. I mean, how do you go wrong with a root crop? Like, it's the best. Everyone loves potatoes. Like, and then add groundnuts to it, add some of these other things, prairie turnip, tuberous pea. Like, you've got some really cool stuff to work with. And you can make a lot of cool, really fun, exciting foods with them. So, legume perspectives, are you guys still planning on, do you expect another zine to come out in the next year or two, or is it kind of a, when it happens, it happens?
Honestly, I don't know the frequency. I think twice a year, and I'm not sure what the next issue is going to be about.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Anywhere that for people that really want to learn more about beans and legumes, you would send them to, just would it be that journal or anything else?
There's so much online now. I think a nice entry might be from a cooking angle. You mentioned lupini beans, for example, or pick your favorite legume, lentil, chickpea, and so on. for any of those crops, there's actually quite a diversity and a lot of different cuisines that have developed around them. I don't know. As someone who likes eating and likes cooking, I just find that an accessible way of connecting with any of this stuff. How to find out about new legume crops or unusual ones? Seed catalogs can sometimes introduce you to new things. There are some nice books. There's Beans by Ken Abruleta, I think. Specialty seed crops like Southern Seed Exchange is a nice one. Some books, Gathering the Desert, that'll talk about things like honey mesquite, a native crop in the American Southwest.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of cool stuff out there once you start digging. Dr. Cannon, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Happy to be able to talk about it with you.